Hi, I'm the serial plagiarist. I wanted to talk about sequel fans again, but don't worry, I'm going to be giving them a tough time and making a video they'll never be able to respond to. Now, a lot of what I say in this video, I've said before many times, but it will be in greater detail. Here are 10 challenges for sequel fans, and if you manage to credibly answer all 10, I will give you a medal just for trying to address all 10. The thing with sequel fans is that they are very selective on what they talk about. Look at Goldman. Even though he makes hour-long analyses, he cherry-picked topics like Ray's and Mary Sue, which is admittingly an overbloated criticism of the sequel trilogy and a minor flaw compared to the bigger, more consequential problems of the sequel trilogy. And I'm willing to just give them that at this point because the Mary Sue criticism is just one problem with a specific character. And even if it's the main character, there's so many other problems with Ray that don't relate to her being so good at everything and being liked and admired by everyone. There's bigger fish people like me should fry, especially now since episode 7 is not the only sequel movie that's out now. So without further ado, here are 10 challenges for sequel fans. Again, none of the sequel trilogy fans will be able to address all 10 without making weak points or skirting around the issue, but I'd love to be proven wrong. First, let's start off with what is possibly the easiest challenge. Of course, easiest does not mean easy by nature. Given this is a behind the scenes thing, it doesn't automatically apply to the films themselves, but I usually use this as the first line of defense to ask sequel fans confronting questions. So, if you didn't know, George Lucas was lied to before, during, and after the acquisition of Lucasfilm by Disney. In a separate topic, George Lucas was burnt out by all the online prequel hate. George's first choice to sell Star Wars was to the Walt Disney Corporation. George Lucas saw Bob Iger, the Disney CEO, as a friend. Before he sold the rights to Disney, he and Bob Iger had an agreement that they would use the sequel trilogy treatments for, well, the sequel trilogy. This wasn't in the contract, but it isn't the kind of thing that would be. George Lucas placed a significant amount of trust in Bob Iger that he would definitely use his sequel treatments. As we all know, the sequel trilogy, beyond a few vague ideas at best, discarded his treatments very early on in the sequel trilogy's production. And George Lucas felt betrayed. The source for this is Bob Iger himself in his autobiography, The Ride of a Lifetime, in the chapter in which he discusses the acquisition of Lucasfilm. This one chapter sparked mass outrage from those already disgruntled with Disney's treatment of Star Wars. The CEO of Disney, in his own words, said, and I quote, "George Lucas felt betrayed." This one quote single-handedly proves the shameless mentality of a corporate executive, but beyond that, this fact pretty much kills anyone's respect for Disney and the sequel trilogy and those who made it. We know this definitely happened because this is a description from the CEO of Disney, aka the one who was at fault. This fact is also backed up by George in the Charlie Rose interview, although he doesn't explicitly say Bob Iger lied to him. So what is described here is an irrefutable fact. Commonly when I see a video defending the sequel trilogy, I ask one simple question. Why would you support the sequels after the revelation that George Lucas was lied to? Most of the time, I don't receive a proper response, but the few times I do, one response I got was outright denial of the evidence and that I was supporting fake news spread around by Mike Zero, or those who respond show their true colors by expressing hatred towards George Lucas. I think it's clear at this point that sequel fans don't care about honesty or don't care about the franchise, but here's your chance to prove me wrong. Your first challenge is to properly respond to the question I gave previously. Why would you support the sequels after the revelation that George Lucas was lied to? Again, looking at the context of what happened, most if not everyone would agree that promising something and then refusing to do so is wrong. Especially if the person who sold you the rights sold it to you for a steal price. George Lucas might have donated Star Wars to Disney. If you can answer why you support the sequels, despite the fact that the original visionary mind was backstabbed by the company that made the sequels, without denying facts or expressing hatred towards the man, then you're all set for the next challenge. People who go for expressing hatred towards Lucas cite incorrect narratives like saved in the edit and other anti-Lucas straw man arguments. Some like to say that George Lucas doesn't have a say anymore because he sold the rights and therefore has no input nor the right to decide where Star Wars goes, which leads me to my next point. George Lucas is the visionary mind behind Star Wars, and he knows better than anyone else about his own creation because he is the creator. He came up with it with his mind. George Lucas is Star Wars, and anyone who says otherwise needs to be lured into a dark alleyway and bashed over the head until they comply to reality. Unfortunately, a lot of people think they know Star Wars better than the original creator, and try to argue against the creator in his own work. The only valid time this is reasonable is when the creator changes his mind on the meaning of his creation, which George has actually done. Which is why I don't give anyone who criticizes General Grievous, because Lucas was indecisive on what his personality and traits would be like, any flack for it, because it's reasonable. George Lucas shouldn't have been indecisive on who Grievous was. When George Lucas introduced midichlorians, George Lucas did not contradict anything. It was just fanboys of the original movies who didn't realize it was made by George as well, thought their preconceived perception of what the Force was the definitive correct one. They made the false assumption that midichlorians were the Force, when they're actually a means of measuring Force sensitivity. Another example, people that like to argue that Yoda's depiction in the prequels was character assassination, but unlike Grievous, there are nuances people don't consider. First, the prequels are just that. Prequels. Stories that predate the original movies, with a younger Master Yoda in a vastly different position than the original trilogy. In the original trilogy, Yoda was a hermit in hiding and learning from the mistakes of the Jedi Order. In the prequels, Yoda is the Grand Master who is in the middle of making the mistakes. Just like any prequel should, it's showing us how we got to Yoda on Dagobah. The same is true for the lightsaber complaint. It's explicitly shown in Revenge of the Sith that Yoda lost his lightsaber, thus why he didn't have one in Empire Strikes Back. So point is, what makes prequel hate different from sequel hate is that prequel hate was people thinking they knew better than the original creator, while sequel hate is people calling out how J.J. Abrams nor Rian Johnson understand anything about George Lucas's saga. So here's your challenge. Try to argue why George Lucas's opinion doesn't matter, even in the modern day, even though it clearly does. Again, those who argue he doesn't matter anymore are the same people who say George Lucas is a creative hack and a greedy businessman, an awful person, blah blah blah. To reinforce the first 2 points on top of that, one reason why the sequels suck is because neither JJ or Rian understand anything about Star Wars and the meaning of it. The sequels are not authentic as true Star Wars movies, but that doesn't automatically mean they are unfaithful adaptations. That's an important distinction I want to make. When it comes to both JJ and Rian, they have contradicted what George Lucas has explained about his work. As an example, balance in the Force. Balance in the Force, according to George Lucas, aka the guy who's irrefutably correct, means the dominance of the light side over the dark. When the Empire reigned, the Force was imbalanced and the galaxy was corrupted. When Anakin was redeemed and got rid of Sidious, balance was restored. This is because the will of the Force knows better than any one individual. Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi didn't know that, and had the incorrect belief that balance in the Force meant equal light side and equal dark side, not understanding that the Force had a will that was strictly defined as the light side.
He's realized that if he brings the Jedi back into this, then the Sith are going to rise up again, and the whole thing is going to start again, and it's just going to be more misery.
So one foundation for Luke's character is that he realizes that balance in the Force meant equal Jedi and equal Sith. It's balance to the Force, not Force users, Rian. This proves that Rian Johnson doesn't understand the Force, nor does he understand Luke Skywalker. This is the single argument I use to get sequel fans to shut up about how Luke was well written. If Luke believed this, then he would be a delusional, crazy old man. which he was in The Last Jedi. That's what we've been criticizing all this time. That's why we've been naming him Jake Skywalker. A core pillar for Luke's character in The Last Jedi is the incorrect meaning of balance in the Force. What essentially happened is that Rian Johnson was trying to decide what Star Wars meant, but it wasn't his place to decide at all. The only person who dictates what Star Wars is or isn't is George Lucas, and only George Lucas. Rian should have stuck to what George Lucas meant with Star Wars, or he should have just fucked off. Don't think this is solely going to be a bashing of Rian Johnson, because contrary to the popular narrative, JJ doesn't understand Star Wars either. There are many examples I could use, but one is Force sensitivity. JJ, in many statements before and during the sequel trilogy's release cycle, talked about his preconceived notion of what it meant to have the Force, and how he thought the Force is in everyone and that anyone could use it, resulting in a mishmash of the overall story because the prequel said one thing and the sequel said another. It's what led to characters like Rey, because she just believed in the Force. She wasn't explicitly someone who had a high metachlorian count or anything like that. She just had the power because everyone has it. The only thing he got right was that the Force was in everyone. But the reason, say, Greedo couldn't use the Force was because he didn't have a strong enough connection to it. I equate J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, in terms of their writing philosophy, as Darksiders. George Lucas, as the creator of the story, is essentially the will of Star Wars. He knows better than any other being. But JJ and Rian didn't care about adhering to the will of George Lucas, and instead imposed their own will on Star Wars, which is why the sequels retcon, contradict, and fuck up practically everything about the story that wasn't theirs. Just like the dark side, it was inherently selfish and corrupted the franchise around them. This is why I found it impossible to respect JJ and Rian as people, because they couldn't respect something they were essentially stealing, not borrowing, since Disney didn't give Star Wars back to George after they were done. So here's your challenge, sequel fans. Explain why the sequels are good, despite the fact that they make an absolute roadkill on continuity and destroy the foundation and meaning of Star Wars. The Star Wars sequels is just that, sequels. A sequel is a work that continues a previous one. And the sequels are bad because they are bad sequels to the original 6 movies, because the people who made them know absolutely nothing about Star Wars and impose their own will on the story. Those arguing George Lucas has no say anymore are no better than JJ and Rian. They are selfishly imposing their own will on Star Wars and ignoring the will of George Lucas. If you've made it this far, let's continue. The sequels contribute nothing to the overall story. This doesn't make them bad movies automatically, but it shows the cash grab nature of the sequel trilogy. They just made extensions of a story that was concluded without realizing that they needed to do some legwork and give a reason to continue the story. We all know that there was no plan for the sequel trilogy at all, but they don't contribute to the thematic purpose of the original 6 movies. George Lucas, the person who no one can argue with when it comes to Star Wars, has said that the complete saga was Anakin's story, from childhood to death. We see the entire life story of Anakin, his freedom from slavery, his inner conflict, his struggles, his fall, his bitterness, and then his redemption. It is a complete story. Admittingly, even though I am confident my version of the sequel trilogy didn't break any of the rules, it didn't adhere to the thematic purpose of the saga, that being to make it Anakin's story, which, now that I understand this, I will involve Anakin more in my idea of the sequel trilogy. But if I wanted to continue the story the way I wanted, I'd just drop the numbers. And that's the big dilemma with the sequel trilogy. The fact that they weren't thematically sound with the complete saga, but also that they were numbered. Numbering the sequels 7, 8, and 9 is a disgrace. They should have had Anakin in them if that was the case. You might be asking how they were supposed to continue Anakin's story if he's dead, and half of you might expect an answer like, don't make the sequels at all, or don't number them, but my answer is actually a lot different. As we all know, Anakin became a Force ghost, so what they should have done if they wanted to continue the saga is continue Anakin's story, perhaps by having him reflect on his entire life and then finally letting go of his consciousness and letting him become one with the Force. That's established to be a thing. In Heir to the Empire, Yoda and Obi-Wan let go of their consciousness and allowed themselves to become one with the Force as a whole. This would have been an actually clever way of continuing the story of the Chosen One, and allowed them to number them at the same time. That way, it would be after his death, but not be a lazy attempt at resurrecting the character. But because JJ as a prequel hater loathed the legend we know as Hayden Christensen, the closest we had to an appearance by the Chosen One was him chanting to Rey among all the other Jedi, something that breaks yet more rules. Most of the Jedi speaking to Rey did not retain their consciousness after death. They clearly just did that for fan service without recognizing consistency. The only way they can fix that is by creating another problem by resurrecting Mace Windu and having him learn to retain his consciousness until his actual death. Then it explains how he spoke to Rey. But of course it would ruin his death in episode 3, and given episode 3 is the best, I will not accept that just to fill in a plot hole. So challenge number 4. Explain why the sequels truly contribute to the Skywalker saga. Given the protagonist of the sequels wasn't even a Skywalker, and no, a surname switch isn't going to cut it, this question will probably be impossible to answer, if not definitely. Explain how the thematic purpose was maintained, and then we'll talk. The reason why the sequels have so many plot holes is because the sequels didn't establish why anything was happening. It didn't explore the universe, and the scale was smaller than what was practical for the sequels to actually make sense. Sequel fans actively cherry-pick the criticisms we talk about, instead of trying to address all the problems. I've never seen a sequel fan anywhere in the universe try to defend against every criticism. They mostly only talk about the criticisms people made about the sequels at first, like the sequels being rip-offs, Rey is a Mary Sue, Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi was out of character and sucked, bringing Palpatine back, etc. But through observation, now that the whole trilogy is out, and we see the whole picture, we have come up with deeper reasons why the sequels actually suck, as well as nuances for all those specific criticisms. Like with the rip-off complaint, the reason it matters, compared to a rehashy sequel like Ghostbusters 2, is because the sequels invalidated the original 6 movies by undoing the Rebel triumph in Return of the Jedi and resetting the status quo to Empire vs. Rebels. Ghostbusters 2, while it retreads the same structure as the original, have the Ghostbusters face a threat independent to that of the first movie. In the first movie, it was Gozer. In the second movie, it was Vigo. Ghostbusters the video game and Ghostbusters Afterlife, while they do have the Ghostbusters face the same threat as the first movie, do not reset the conflict, only continue it. This is what the Thrawn trilogy does so well. It doesn't reset the conflict, they continue it. But back to the lack of world building. The reasons people complain about plot holes can be chalked up to the films giving zero context for the wider galaxy. For example, the reason why Starkiller Base makes no sense is because where did the significantly smaller First Order get the resources and money to make a bigger, better Death Star? This plot hole is somewhat patched in the novel Bloodline, where it's explained that there was a rift in the New Republic Senate, and different parties secretly started giving money and resources to the First Order. So the New Republic was essentially paying the First Order for its eventual demise. That actually makes sense. And this should have been explained in The Force Awakens, because it explains what is essentially a copy-paste, nonsensical Death Star 3. Although it still doesn't make sense on how the Starkiller Base laser can hyperspace all the way to the New Republic, and how systems far away from the New Republic could see it. The Visual Dictionary tries to patch this up too, but Pablo Hidalgo should have just faced it. There was no way to explain it without using mental gymnastics or making a complete arsehat out of yourself. Why Leia is with the Resistance and not the New Republic army, or what the Resistance actually is, how the First Order rose from the ashes of the Empire, who Snoke is, and why the war is actually happening, would have all been non-issues if the writers did world building. The reason they didn't is because of J.J. Abrams, but we'll talk about that in the next point. For now, your new challenge is to explain the plot holes without relying on external source material and explaining how the sequel trilogy does enough world building. I've never had anyone talk back to me after I brought this up. So this challenge is unfortunately going to keep you occupied for a long time. But that's fine. Take all the time you need. Sequel fans use the reception of The Force Awakens, at least at first, to try and say that the hate is unfounded, at least specifically for that movie. Well, let me explain why so many changed their mind, especially after The Last Jedi came out. J.J. Abrams is a pioneer, and basically the mascot, of a writing technique he calls the mystery box. To explain what this is, he infamously used this trick in the TV show Lost. Basically what he did is set up questions that hooked the audience in and kept people guessing and encouraged them to continue watching until the very finale of the show. Basically what he was doing is coming up with questions and heavily relied on the audience's imagination instead of his own to sell the story. From what I hear, when Lost finally did end, the answers were so lame and disappointing, and the fact there was going to be absolutely no way there was going to be a satisfying payoff for it all, especially for how long the show actually went on for. I think what JJ was trying to do works best when it's in a concise standalone story. Like with the Maze Runner movie, that film keeps the mystery of why all the boys are in the maze, and it doesn't just cut off the story until the next movie is made. That's the example of the mystery box done better. JJ's flaw in writing almost perfectly describes the sequels. Who are Rey's parents? Who is Snoke? What is Luke's conflict? Why did Kylo Ren fall to the dark side? Who are the Knights of Ren? All of those did the exact same thing Lost did all those years ago. It made people go crazy with questions and speculate to the end of the earth the answers. JJ again was relying on the audience's imagination instead of his own, which is backwards from a storytelling perspective. We go to watch, read, or play fiction to see an author tell his complete story, and not let the audience come up with their own story and fill in the blanks. The reason why the sequel sucked so much was because the payoff was so hollow and underwhelming. Who are Rey's parents? Nobodies, and then Palpatine. We'll get into the consistencies later. Who is Snoke? A clone created by the true villain, Palpatine. Again, we'll get to that later. What is Luke's conflict? Pretty much nothing. He just went onto the island to die and thinks the Jedi should end. Why did Kylo Ren fall to the dark side? Because Palpatine was fucking with his mind. Who are the Knights of Ren? Fuck if I know. They are just bad guys that are meant to be killed off. Hopefully you get the point, but on top of that, even the titles for the films are mystery boxes. The Force Awakens. That isn't meant to be taken literally, but what does that mean? There's something about The Force Awakening and Rey and Finn or something, but that doesn't answer the question directly. Plus, it isn't a key part of what actually happens in the movie. Unlike Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith, The Last Jedi, the movie doesn't make it clear on what it means. They mention the term The Last Jedi maybe like 2 times to my recollection, but it's just so vague, and was part of Rian Johnson's themes, and he wanted you to think about the deeper meaning of the story. And as I said previously, the deeper meaning of The Last Jedi violates Star Wars by George Lucas. Then there's The Rise of Skywalker. Not only does the opposite happen in the movie, because both Leia and Ben Solo die, officially ending the bloodline, but even Kathleen Kennedy confirms that it's just meant to invoke speculation.
I think The Rise of Skywalker, it doesn't answer anything. It's provocative, it asks questions, and it could mean a lot of different things. And I think that that's what was important to us. We didn't want to have a title that felt like it was telling you the story.
So here's your challenge. Explain how the mystery box assists the movie instead of hindering it, and how J.J. Abrams' reliance on audiences' imaginations is a good thing for a story, and not a lazy way of selling the next movie.
Get tickets now.
The sequels can't even be watched 20 years into the future. The way they were supposed to be watched was at the moment right when they came out from 2015 to 19. That's not how you make a movie remembered or timeless. Speaking of, I hear a lot of sequel fans talk about how kids 20 years into the future are going to look back on the sequels as their first and favourites. And this is very unlikely and absurd. Prequel resurgence happened not because of relative comparison to the sequels, but also because what people came to realize about the prequels are solid foundations that the sequels do not have. For example, the prequels have a cohesive, connected story to each other, but on top of that, the original trilogy too. Each entry of the original saga is part of a whole story. The Phantom Menace is not a movie fans can skip. What happens in it has direct consequences to the sequel, and the sequel after that, and so on. The prequels are reactive to what happens in each other's separate entries. Anakin evolves from fear, anger, hate, and then suffering, told throughout the course of 3 movies, and then continued in the original trilogy. It all fits. It's like poetry. They rhyme. As I said before, the sequels don't contribute anything to the overall saga, but on top of that, they actively contradict each other. The Force Awakens does not connect to The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker, nor does The Last Jedi connect to The Force Awakens or The Rise of Skywalker. You could put it in any combination, and they are like 3 different IPs with how much they contradict each other. The most blatant example is Rey being a nobody, and then a Palpatine in the movie after that. They couldn't make up their damn minds. And according to Nerd Dominus, who has made a video discussing whose fault it is for the sequel trilogy as a whole, whether it's Ryan's, JJ's, or some other person's, he makes it clear that in The Force Awakens, that her parents were intended to be Han and Leia. That means that all 3 movies have 3 different answers to who Rey's parents are. So pretty much you have to stick with 1, and not 2 or 3, otherwise you'd be a fan of 2 or 3 different movies that are supposed to be in the same universe, but none of them work with each other at all. So pick one. Is she a Solo, Nobody, or Palpatine? People have pointed out how many retcons and backtracking J.J. Abrams made because he's a spineless coward and can't carry on with the story Ryan told in The Last Jedi. It's impractical to like all 3 movies because none of them work with each other. You have different rules or rule breaks, as I established way back when. That's why there are divides, even in the sequel fanbase, which, oh boy, we'll get to that. But first, the challenge for sequel fans. You need to explain how the sequels are a cohesive story with each other, and tell the same story instead of mishmashing and changing the story as a reaction to backlash. And do it without blaming Last Jedi haters, because J.J. Abrams was just a spineless coward who has the weakest willpower in Hollywood and changed everything out of fear of further backlash. Anyways, next point. The sequel trilogy has divided the fan base for the worse, especially The Last Jedi. People are at each other's necks, and I can explain why. Both JJ and Ryan are pretentious filmmakers with enormous egos who cannot look past their lack of talent and see their dumb good luck and adherence to Hollywood shit standards as self-worth. Rian Johnson specifically has talked about how he's the type of guy who likes to talk about how much he likes dividing people.
I would be worried if everybody across the board was like, yeah, that was a good movie. It's much more exciting to me when you get, a group of people who are like coming up to you and really, really excited about it, and you know it's going to be something that they're having their DVD collection and watch over. And the way that I got into Miller's Crossing, maybe, I don't know. But and then there are other people who walk out literally saying that was the worst movie I've ever seen. Having those two extremes to me is the mark of the type of movie that I want to make. So
even if it's out of context, it's a sixth sense of foreshadowing on what The Last Jedi ended up being. Luke Skywalker's depiction is terrible, as I've already established, but it was quite clearly done that way. The reason he didn't ease us into Luke Skywalker's sudden change in personality is because it was like a social experiment where he wanted to divide half and half of the fan base who would take one of 2 different messages out of the movie. Luke Skywalker could have had most of the self-conflicts done in a different way without reducing him to a pathetic, dirty, homeless man. But he went for the most blunt approach possible, and this was clearly done to divide fans. Look at how unapologetic he's been to people who didn't like the movie, calling them man babies. Not only is that unprofessional, but it's given me an even greater respect for George Lucas, because no matter how much Red Letter Media and all those other idiots talk trash about him, he never, ever lashed out at them. even though if he did, it would have been completely reasonable given how far they went and how much they crossed the line. Rian Johnson is obviously someone who aims to provoke one half and amaze the other half with pretentious themes and messages that break continuity. This is as blatant as a case as I'm making it. Rian Johnson did not make a Star Wars movie for everyone, so please stop saying that. He did not set out to make the best movie possible, but unfortunately people had high standards and therefore he wouldn't be able to please everyone, because that narrative is wrong. I'm not saying some people didn't have unrealistically high, lucid dream-like standards, but most people's high standards are justified given the foundation of the original 6 movies. This isn't like Terminator, which had a drop after the 3rd movie, because Star Wars was a 6-way streak of quality, which is an impressive record for a film series that was broken with The Force Awakens. This is why I have high standards, because George Lucas made it that way, and the inheritors better step up to the level of George Lucas. Go big or go home. So how does this relate to the next challenge? Well, here's what I want you to do. Explain how the sequels weren't made to divide fans, because on top of everything I've said prior to this point, it's a stance I'm very confident in taking. Have you ever noticed how closed off Disney is compared to the George Lucas era? What I mean by this is whenever they talk, it's only about the exciting stuff, but we know for a fact that to the people working on the sequels, it was anything but. J.W. Rinsler, bless your soul, was the writer of the behind-the-scenes books of the original 6 movies, where he would give the full picture into the development of all 6 movies. Well, Rinsler was going to write a book doing the same for The Force Awakens, but the thing is, Disney as a corporation having a narcissistic squeaky clean image canned Rinsler's book after he planned to go into the whole story of the behind-the-scenes production of The Force Awakens, as he gave an accurate account of what happened, and it didn't paint the whole thing as sunshine and rainbows. In other words, it was development hell. So basically, Rinsler's book was cancelled, and now we rely on second-hand drip feeding of information that seems to come out every fortnight at this point. But that further highlights the disaster that was the sequel trilogy's production. So what Disney essentially did is paint the production of all 3 movies as Disney World in their featurettes. They don't go into the hurdles of the production and how they overcame it. No, they just go on and on about how much fun it was to work on the movie and go on and on and on and on and on and on and on about that. And it's boring, hollow, and dishonest. No film has a flawless production. I would actually like to see the production of all 3 films to see how they overcame problems during filming. Like maybe how the set was too hot or too cold, or how hard it was making a particular set, or maybe how some of the scenes were hard to shoot. Stuff like that. You guys know that urban legend known as Mauschwitz that has Disney World employees describe their job as the unhappiest place in the world? Opposite to that of the tourists, which is a play on words on, well, you know. That's exactly like the development of the sequels. They present it to outsiders as a happy place to work, but it's actually darker than that. Way darker. Okay, maybe not that dark. On top of this, you look at a bunch of interviews given over the course of the sequel trilogy's release cycle, before, during, and after, and you'll see how much everyone contradicts each other. J.J. Abrams says one thing, then Kathleen Kennedy says something else, Bob Iger swoops in to say that, George Lucas goes on about this and that, and it just confuses you. Who's telling the truth? This is what makes it even harder to determine what happened exactly. Although we can make it easier by taking context into account, and when things were said, and the general track record of honesty from each person. This makes the sequel trilogy very mysterious, and not just because of the mystery boxes. But that's not directly relevant. What I'm challenging you to now is to explain why you trust Disney unfathomably, given their track record. A lot of what sequel fans believe is based on what a certain person who worked on the sequel said, when it may contradict another statement. This is mostly an external reason, but it's very important for you to answer, because Disney is a corporation, not an independent entity like George Lucas. Anyone who knows the first thing about a monopoly like Disney is that they don't give a shit about quality, just money. One last challenge before we're done. Stop cherry picking. If you're going to debate with sequel haters like me, address everything they say about the sequels and understand why they hate it. The Mary Sue complaint is only a minor flaw with the sequels, and not even close to a full view of the bigger picture, such as everything I've pointed out to you. All the examples I listed previously is a good place to start, because I find it hard to believe you managed to make it this far. You're probably still on number 1, and I'm not trying to be mean. Also, if you decide to stop cherry picking, here's an additional challenge. Explain why you cherry picked in the first place, because to me, it seemed like you can't actually explain anything on why the sequels are good and don't deserve the hate. An infuriating example of how you cherry pick is the expanded universe. In debates where you protest against the sequels being decanonized, the only thing you have to say about the expanded universe was that it was never canon, which misses the mark completely. But your basis from that is quotes from George Lucas. They are all out of context, cherry-picked, misunderstood, or not representative of the full picture. But you don't even realize that if George Lucas defines canonicity, then the sequels aren't canon either. So here's an extra challenge. Don't spread lies about the expanded universe. Instead, stick to the facts and explain why it's selfish to decanonize the sequels, and not when Disney got rid of 30 plus years of content to make way for the sequels in the first place. If the expanded universe was never decanonized, the sequels would never exist. Remember that. Also, an extra challenge I have for you is to actually indulge on the expanded universe. Read some of the acclaimed books. The Thrawn Trilogy is a good place to start, given that's commonly referred to as the original sequel trilogy. The order is Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and The Last Command. If you read them, you'll immediately notice the contrast in quality compared to the sequel trilogy. If your reasoning for not doing so is that you don't enjoy reading, then listen to the audiobook while you exercise or lie in bed. To the first sequel fan that contacts me on Discord, start that free 1-month trial of Audible, and I'll buy Heir to the Empire for you. I'll pay for the first book, guilt-free, and you'll realize that the sequels are soulless cash grabs, like we've been saying all this time. Just make sure to get the 20th anniversary edition, and not the monotone original version, because the 20th anniversary edition is the closest to being like a new Star Wars movie. I'm the type of guy who tries to share the expanded universe with others, which is why I've gotten other people's Steam keys for Knights of the Old Republic, because I want them to experience the legend of that game. Also, disclaimer, there is no expiry date or any tricks I'm pulling up my sleeve. Just contact me and I'll send the money to your PayPal, which you'll then use to buy the audiobook. And also show me that you got the audiobook and didn't spend that money on something else through a screenshot. So that's 10, or technically 13 challenges for sequel fans. I have no doubt that sequel fans are going to struggle with number 1, let alone the next 12. And that's by design. I'm not going to make this easy for you. You can persist with your narrative that the sequels are going to be loved in 10 years or whatever, or you can join reality and join the backlash against the corporation that doesn't give a shit about you. The choice is yours. Blue pill or red pill. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes? Hello again, world. I'm the person who plagiarized your mothers, and I'm here to continue the fight against the heavily misguided categories of Star Wars fans. First, we talked about sequel fans in a video they'll never be able to respond to properly. Most of the negative comments spoke about me being a hater without sufficient explanation. Just because you tell me I'm a hater or toxic isn't going to deter me from anything. You should explain why and how. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe you. I don't think I'm a toxic hater. I'm being harsh, but as I said, I'm fed up with sequel fans not addressing the elephant in the room and cherry picking at the same time. My video was a definitive look into the delusion of sequel trilogy fans. It's clear that they won't even dare to watch my video because they want to pluck their ears in and shut down the conversation. It's my way or the highway is the general sentiment I got from those who didn't like my video. If you're watching this and you're both a sequel fan and a prequel hater, your life is about to be flipped upside down, so just take a minute, just sit right there. I'll tell you how prequel hate will be discredited forever. Here are the 10 challenges for prequel haters, a video which no prequel hater will be able to properly respond to. 10 that will give prequel haters their only chance to come clean about their hatred of the movies and George Lucas. Also, watch the video in full context before you respond to it. Understood? Good. Let's rip in. Again, let's start off with the easiest one to talk about. But as I said, for sequel fans, easiest does not mean easy by nature. One of the biggest false narratives about the prequels is the overuse of CGI, made by people who don't know anything about special effects or the behind-the-scenes production of the prequels. We'll get into that later down the line. So the common online narrative is that George Lucas, because he was lazy or whatever, decided to cut corners by having CG instead of practical effects, not understanding the state of special effects. Terminator 2, that had come out 8 years before The Phantom Menace, became one of the most expensive movies made of its time because of the ambitious special effects, among other reasons. 8 years later, CGI was still in its early stages. I'm not saying that we should give it flack because it was 1999. I'm saying we should praise it because it was 1999. Those who criticize the special effects don't properly explain why it looks fake. On top of that, it is on top of ignorant remarks. First, let's start off with the fact that both practical and CG were intertwined. Here are some screenshots of the sets of the Star Wars prequels. Here are a lot of practical models that people assumed was CGI. So unless your argument is that Lucasfilm stole fan models and designs that they could pretend their laziness, as you like to call it, was CGI, good luck finding any evidence for that. As for the stuff that was undoubtedly CGI, people don't understand or appreciate what the prequels did for special effects. Not many people know, but Industrial Light and Magic, when it came to Attack of the Clones, had to invent a lot of the technology to cope with the render times, without even knowing if it would render properly. Let me repeat that. They invented the technology. They created something that was not previously there. The internet narrative has it backwards. Also, when you compare the CGI in the sequel trilogy to the prequels, there's no step up in improvement. They look the same in terms of the final rendering. So it's actually accurate to say that the sequels are the ones with bad CGI. Also, on top of that, people don't appreciate the work that goes into CGI. There's multiple different stages of rendering for any movie that uses CGI. The early Pixar feature films went through this, the Transformers movies went through this, and the prequels went through this. In the early days of sufficient rendering, it would take days to render one frame at quickest. As the technology gets smaller and cheaper, CGI becomes easier. But the prequels must be appreciated for their innovations in film technology. Also, there's something prequel haters need to address. First, why did the prequels need to be all practical? Why couldn't it have CGI? Second, how were they supposed to pull a lot of shots and environments practically? We wouldn't get locations like Mustafar if it were all strictly practical, so it's the opposite of lazy. It was utilized for maximum creativity. Third, explain what overuse of CG actually means. What counts as an overuse of CGI? What would be an underuse of CGI? What would be just right? Maybe you should judge each scene based on how it's presented and judge it scene by scene. First, make sure what you're criticizing is definitely CG. Second, in the scene that is CG, explain how they could have pulled it off practically and why it matters for it to be done practically, because arguing that there should be consistency between that and the OT doesn't hold up, because you need to consider limitations and what's available to the prequels, and that wasn't available to the OT. That's your challenge. If you do your research, you'll learn that the CGI numbers in the prequels were not lazy or even closely resembling the number you thought they had. And leads me into my next point. Instead of listening to red letter media make assumptions,
he controls every aspect of the movie. He probably got rid of those people that questioned him creatively a long time ago.
Do some research of your own. A random journalist talking trash about the prequels is not the place you should look. You should look at something like interviews, behind the scenes featurettes, etc. Star Wars Insider has massive bomb drops that give bigger insight into the production of the films. Remember the racial stereotype argument for Jar Jar? You'd learn in the behind-the-scenes featurettes for The Phantom Menace that Jar Jar's mannerisms started with the casting of Ahmed Best, not George Lucas. This ties into George Lucas's directing style, where he doesn't utilize method acting, that he casts the actors who do exactly what he wants in the characters, which also ties into the debunking that it was surrounded by yes men. If you look at the production of the prequels, you'll see it was anything but. The main writer of the prequels was George, but there were many ghost writers involved with script writing of the prequels. That also debunked the idea that George was arrogant and thought he could write a script all on his own. And also, if you do your own research, you'll learn that contrary to the narrative, George Lucas approached at least 4 filmmakers to direct the prequels. That includes Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, and Robert Zemeckis, and they all told him he should direct the prequels because they had faith in his abilities, and that directing the prequels while being an honor would be too daunting for them. George Lucas was not some arrogant bastard who thought he knew it all. This is a false narrative perpetuated by the internet. You can easily tell Red Letter Media, for example, cherry-picked parts from the featurettes, and notice how he doesn't explain the context behind any of the featurettes. Practically everything used to incriminate George is badly researched and relies on assumptions. What happened is that the ignorant narrative based on blind hatred became more and more prominent, that it was actually harder and harder to find the actual facts. None of the infamous prequel critics watched the featurettes, and unlike the Disney featurettes, the prequel featurettes are a much more honest, full look into the prequels. You can tell this because they go into the problems they had during filming and how they overcame it. You see them making the movie. If prequel critics actually wanted to know the prequels inside and out for their hour-plus critiques, they could spend at least 10 minutes watching the featurettes. Then you'd learn the context behind the out-of-context clips Plinkett showed, where he thought everyone would be about to start pointing fingers. I'll link the behind-the-scenes featurettes, and if you have any guts, you'll watch them and see that you're wrong. So here's your challenge. Look at the actual facts, and using the actual evidence, argue how your narrative is correct, even though it clearly isn't. Look at George Lucas explain his work in full context. You'll realize what George Lucas was thinking when he made said decision, and you'll know enough to realize that the internet was full of crap and had no idea what they were talking about. The next time you watch the prequels, think more about how the whole movie is structured, how lines are said, when they're said, who says them, how they're said, in the context of the scene. Most of the time, people pull a line out of context in a meme video. This can be done to make any line look stupid. But if you want to explain why a line is so bad, explain the context of the line, how it's done in the scene, what's said before and after, how the characters say it. Given it's your most used example, I Don't Like Sand has been ridiculed for so long without people understanding the context of the scene and what's going on and why it's going on. The previous line is Padme talking about how she loves the water on her homeworld, and Anakin says, "I don't like sand," and this is done to contrast Anakin's background compared to Padme's. Also, it sounds awkward with or without context, but how does that make the movie bad? Looking at the context, we've been shown consistently throughout the movie that Anakin is a socially and romantically illiterate Jedi, detached from his attachments that he still thinks about, indecisive, unstable, and generally has a hard time talking. We're shown all across the movie this. It's character consistent. Comparing this line to "Somehow Palpatine Returned," the context of this line is supposed to have the Resistance talk about, well, Palpatine's return. This line is awful because on top of the sequel trilogy itself doing no build-up to Palpatine's return, the build-up is non-existent. On top of the line being non-explanatory on a massive plot hole, it doesn't advance the story, reflect characters, convey emotion, or anything. Hence, it's a bad line. Before the line is said, the Resistance is talking about the news. It's said in the most embarrassing, non-urgent way possible. It comes across like Poe is just saying Palpatine is back for no reason. Also, one of the following lines says that cloning was a secret only the Sith knew, which is the biggest retcon a movie could make. JJ, you should have watched the prequels. The reason people criticize the dialogue is because they wanted it to be a certain way. You can clearly tell that an OT purist imagination was on the coolest things they could have come up with without thinking on whether or not it would make sense or serve the story. If Anakin was a cool, badass war veteran, then how would that serve the story? The reason Anakin in TCW doesn't work as well is because he doesn't get that much character development. He just has these big dark side moments that are thrown in as roots for his turn, instead of having Anakin gradually struggle. Having Anakin start off as a kind-hearted slave boy, then into an unstable, emotionally driven teenager, to a more controlled yet still conflicted Jedi, is a more well-written arc. In every Prequel Haters rewrite of the prequel trilogy, they want to bump up Anakin's age. Why in hell would that improve the story, given the context of what happens? Anakin was 9 in The Phantom Menace because George wanted to show us Anakin's attachments, how he's already developed certain worldviews, is talented and would have a promising future if he wasn't a slave. He's a dreamer who wants more for himself and others, and it's done through the lens of a kid to show the innocence of the character. Having Anakin be 18 would just break that. Starting when he's 18 would just feel unnatural because Anakin would be way too developed and be what the story ended up making him. As a random comparison, in The Truman Show, Truman might have been similar in many ways to that he's a dreamer, he dreams of more, but the difference with Truman, for example, is that he's 30, and the story adapts to that. Even though he dreams of more, they wrote him in a way that makes sense for a 30-year-old. He dreams of more, but cannot because he's trapped where he is and he has to be an adult about many things, because it's expected of him, and because the TV showrunners designed him that way. Take context into account and how the character is written and utilized for their age, and you'll see there's nothing wrong. This needs to be judged case by case. As another example, John Connor in Terminator 2 was around the same age. He fit the Chosen One archetype, but he was in a different situation. He lived in a universe where he was raised by a crazy delusional mother, or so he thought, and when he was told she was crazy, he believed them because there was no evidence. John Connor was not kind-hearted in Terminator 2. He was a troublemaker and a smug shit-talker, who in his most unlikable scene gets the T-800 to pull the hair of someone who is actually trying to help him when he called for help. John Connor's arc was different. His character was different because of the context of the story. And with Anakin, people should stop thinking of what they imagined Anakin would be like, and look through it through the context of the story, how it's presented and so on. So here's your challenge. Don't cherry pick scenes out of context and throw away what you imagined. Look at the context of what's happening and why it's happening for once. Because
Anakin is an annoying, whiny kid.
Isn't an argument. If he's annoying, describe how that annoyingness derails the story, because a naive or naggy character doesn't automatically make them bad. One of the laziest excuses that prequel haters use to try and brush prequel resurgence under the rug is that people saw the Clone Wars 2008 and mistook the show's quality for believing that the films that it's based on were themselves good. This is incredibly lazy, because to assume that every single prequel fan saw the Clone Wars is ridiculous. I didn't see the Clone Wars until it popped up on Netflix. That's after the show was done. It would be generous to say that 20% of all prequel fans saw the Clone Wars. What about those who love the prequels since release like me? The same thing goes for everything else tied to the prequels. People did not suddenly read Shatterpoint or the Star Wars Republic comics after hating the prequels for so many years. In fact, people who hated the prequels would be less likely to pick up a prequel novel. Also, what you would immediately notice about the Clone Wars is that it doesn't do a good job of tying into the actual prequel movies. They change characters, change things that happened in the prequels, or pander to those who didn't like them. If you hear a prequel hater's description of what they imagined Anakin to be like before TCW came out, you'll see that Anakin's portrayal in TCW is scarily similar, and they didn't care that Anakin rarely gets a self-conflict. In the Clone Wars, it has Anakin commit several war crimes without reflection. Anakin does it without a care in the world, and it's never reflected on again. it just happens. This is actually poor writing, but it adheres to a Prequel Haters description of what they wanted Anakin to be, so they praise it to death. TCW also contradicts the command structure and blind loyalty for the clones in the second movie in return for inhibitor chips, which the complaint that it wasn't explained is invalid because you just didn't pay enough attention to the movies. And also, how does inhibitor chips make for a better explanation? It's actually a worse explanation than genetic modification, because clones could surgically remove their chips without the risk of death, which is the excuse Dave Filoni kept around to have his favourite clone troopers avoid obeying Order 66, which defeats the whole point of Order 66. The clones, if they're handpicked by the writers, can just refuse, so literally any fan favourite clone could disobey. Great writing, guys. Also, since the release of The Bad Batch, the inhibitor chips just complicates things, and a genetic modification is just so much easier to explain all this crap. Also, Count Dooku, Anakin and Obi-Wan meet so many times, it's not even funny. As well as a rivalry between Obi-Wan and Grievous, which didn't happen at all. Would it have been that hard to have Anakin and Obi-Wan come up against Ventress and other miscellaneous villains that didn't appear in the films? It's quite clear that Prequel Haters are just using TCW as an excuse because it's a show they like that pandered to them. The Clone Wars is not consistent with the prequels. It's more so based on the prequels, like how a movie might be based on a book. That doesn't stop them from making the excuse that people's enjoyment of TCW has tricked them into believing the prequels on their own are good. Also, not every prequel fan likes TCW, or might have specific things they like about TCW. The hardcore expanded universe fan might not like TCW because it retcons so many of the stories they grew up reading. People might like the show, but dislike the pandering to the people who didn't like the movies to begin with. TCW is nowhere near a gotcha argument for putting down prequel resurgence. It's just a lazy excuse. Also, from what I've seen of those like Anomaly Inc. and Rick Worley, they barely allude to anything that can be considered TCW territory when they talk about the prequels. It'd be obvious if they talked about that stuff that were from TCW, like inhibitor chips and the like. Your challenge is to stop using TCW and look at people actually analysing the prequels. Because if it were TCW that people liked, then that would be obvious that's what people like. Prequel haters are just bringing up TCW because they're too lazy to come up with counter-arguments for what we say about the prequels on their own. OT fanatics, wherever the hell you are, will you hold the original trilogy to the same standard as the prequels for once? Like, you say it's goofy that Anakin and Obi-Wan use those swingy things to escape the lava fall, and you compare it to Tarzan and say it's ridiculous, and then you forget that A New Hope had Luke swing across with Leia. In fact, it's probably even more like Tarzan, because you could equate Leia to Jane or something. And as I've said previously, the purpose of that swing was to make Obi-Wan jump off to safer ground, so it wasn't pointless. A bigger example that I hear a lot are people complaining to the end of the earth that Maul, Dooku, and Grievous are undeveloped villains with no character. First, you're missing the point of these villains and how they were designed. Two, they're not the main villain, Palpatine is, and they're clearly supposed to be henchmen for the true villain. Like, the reason I give General Hux and the Knights of Ren so much shit is because one of them was made a complete joke and didn't make for a good side villain in the slightest, and the other was a clickbait theory-generating mystery box to invoke theories about them and nothing more. And thirdly, you're not holding the original trilogy to the same standard. You're forgetting about Tarkin, Veers, Jabba the Hutt, and especially Boba Fett. Veers and Boba Fett specifically have absolutely zero character, and I would just love to see you try to explain their characters without relying on external source material, which in that case, you would be the one relying on external media. And on that, before we continue, the prequel trilogy side villains are infinitely more describable and iconic. Let's start with Maul. We're not told much about him, but that's not the point. It's what we're shown about him that makes him an effective threat. And he contrasts Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan with having their greatest threat yet. They were able to stay level-headed throughout the course of the entire movie. But then Darth Maul comes along and poses a challenge to both of them, and one of them ends up dying, and Obi-Wan's reaction is a loud yell. Now let's talk about Dooku. Dooku is presented to us as a fancy upper-class guy, akin to that of a sleazy politician. Although he's more morally sound in the films based on the way he conducts himself, like the face he makes after defeating Anakin and Obi-Wan, how he offers to spare the survivors in the arena, and how he leaks information to Obi-Wan and makes him an offer to join him. Now let's talk about Grievous. Grievous is shown to us as a cunning yet cowardly cyborg, and his coughing shows us that he's actually a living being inside, not a droid. He is overly arrogant and is a smug shit talker, and that he's dangerously skilled with a lightsaber. And Obi-Wan was barely able to outclass him in the end. The excuse I usually get is that his character is cliche or whatever, and akin to a cartoon mustache twirling villain, but if that's the case, then you have to admit that Grievous does have a personality, albeit cliched as you like to call it. So pick one. Does he have no character, even though he clearly does? Or is he personality filled, even though you complained that he had no personality? So, another example of OT fanboys like to complain about whiny Anakin, but then you give the following a free pass.
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters. Well, come on, Red, let's go. This R2 unit has a bad motivator, look. It just isn't fair. Oh, Biggs is right. I'm never gonna get out of here. Not unless you can alter time, speed up the harvest, or teleport me off this rock.
Wait a minute, where'd she go? Bring her back. Play back the entire message.
So is whiny Anakin the actual problem, or did you just want him to be a cool lightsaber swinging ladies man confidentio motherfucker? So what I'm challenging you to is to hold the original trilogy to the same standard, because a lot of what you criticize the prequels for can also be criticisms of the originals. Corny dialogue out of context, the originals also had scenes shot in front of a blue screen. Not very practical there, was it? Go through a lot of the criticisms of the prequels, and then immediately realize that the originals have a lot of the same problems. If you disagree, then make a distinction. Every single prequel hater who criticized the prequels isn't watching them properly. The way you're looking at the prequels is backwards. You see, the prequels are not supposed to be watched as prequels. They are supposed to be watched as the beginning of the story. Let me explain. The reason we get so many morons constantly compare them to the precious and utterly perfect original trilogy is that they're having the prequels compete with the original trilogy, when they're supposed to be watched as one complete story, from beginning to end. Now, you can't change the fact that a lot of people saw the originals first, because that's what came out first. People didn't know there was going to be a prequel trilogy, but none of the OT fanatics have tried to sit down to watch it 1 to 6. They watch it in a way where they aren't actually watching the movies. They're actively judging them based on another trilogy of movies, and it's backwards to how the prequels were designed. You can compare them to the original trilogy, but also try to compare them as a 6-part saga as well. Think of the prequels as the first half, and the originals as the second half. You're judging these movies based on one outlook. When I judge the sequels, I try to look at it from all angles. They don't work as sequels, they don't work with each other on their own, and they don't work as parts of a larger story. And in case someone is going to try and say I'm not looking at it from the angle of watching them first, that's a false equivalence. Not only do the sequels heavily rely on pre-established recognition for like 90% of these films, but also they were not designed to be watched first. They were designed to be watched after episode 6. Prequels, on the other hand, they were designed to be watched after episode 6. The prequels, on the other hand, were designed to be watched first, which is something many seem to refuse to do. And yes, I'm not going to look at it from the perspective of watching the sequels first. Ever. Because there's no reason to. Point is, looking at the prequels the way you do has really hindered you immensely in your effort to judge them fairly. Heh, I'm just joking. Of course you made no effort to watch the prequels in different ways, with a different perspective. Let's just say you are completely incapable of watching it the way you're supposed to. So how about this? Get someone who hasn't watched any of the Star Wars movies to watch it 1 to 6, and do it without influencing their opinion or telling them anything about the movies other than they exist in the general facts about it. Get them to watch the films by themselves and ask them about their experience. People who watch the original complete saga like they're supposed to, or set aside their original trilogy biases, can enjoy the whole thing. That's why first-timers who watch them 1 to 6 enjoy them all. They're supposed to be watched that way. I know you're too much of a coward to show any first-timers the movies the way they're supposed to be watched. Throw away the my way or highway approach and actually show them the chronological way. It might inform your critique, because as someone who saw the OT first, you'll have a whole new fresh perspective. That's what I want to do with my KOTOR remake critique when it eventually comes out. I'll get my younger brother, who isn't all that into Star Wars in the first place, and is more of a casual enjoyer, to play the remake, and then tell me what he thinks as someone who's never played the original game. And that way, I can look at it from the perspective of someone who has played the original, and someone who hasn't. Also, I'll be playing it on PC and him on his PS5. Yes, we managed to get a PS5. Lady Luck was on our side. Anyways, next challenge. Despite being fanatics of the original trilogy, you never seem to understand a thing about them. You go on and on about how Darth Vader is a badass, and the contrast between him and his prequel counterpart makes Anakin a bad character. But what you're doing here is missing the point of Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader. You think the core of his character is a badass warrior in shiny black armor, but what he actually is a tragic character. A man fallen from grace. Someone who's lost everything. Someone who's been consumed by the darkness. The reason he was in that cool looking armor in the first place was because he was burnt and left for dead. The reason why he was a skilled warrior and rage-filled because he had lost everything, and he swore to himself that he would get his revenge on Obi-Wan. So that's why he went so far to practice his skills with a lightsaber and the Force. His badassery, as you like to call it, is only a byproduct of other factors in the story. Pay attention. Another example is that you don't have a clue what the Force is and how it works. The reason many of you liked Rey, for example, is based on your incorrect interpretation on how one achieves access to tap into the Force. You seem to believe that it's something you just believe in because it indulges your fantasy that you too could just believe in the Force. Well, knock it off and pay attention. You seem to think midichlorians were just something the prequels came up with out of their asses. That's dead wrong. It was already confirmed in the original trilogy that Force sensitivity wasn't genetic. Remember the line about how the Force was in the Skywalker family in Return of the Jedi? That directly meant that it happens in bloodlines, meaning that it's genetic. What wasn't explained was the specifics. Also, Lucas conceptualized midichlorians in 1977, and they're inspired by what we humans have called mitochondria. If a single prequel hater actually did some research, they'd realize midichlorians were integral to the story from the very beginning. The reasons midichlorians weren't introduced into the plot right away is because they weren't directly plot relevant. That doesn't mean they didn't exist at all. They weren't mentioned because they weren't relevant. And I guarantee that if midichlorians were in the original trilogy, none of the fanatics would have questioned it. Period. When the OT does something, it gets a free pass. And when the prequels do, it's an abominable piece of garbage and stuff. Also, OT fanatics don't seem to realize that Force sensitivity, through genetics, was established in Return of the Jedi when Luke says the Force is strong in his family. It isn't just explained why his family is so strong in the Force. If you have a criticism that relates to the overarching story, do some research and use your head to determine whether or not it was part of the story or not. Listen to George Lucas explain the story in relation to the overall story and you'll see what I mean. Speaking of, the person who knows Star Wars best, and always will, is George Lucas. In general, I'm tired of people cherry-picking the times they listen to what George Lucas says. One example being that they used George Lucas to say the expanded universe was never canon, but not holding the sequel trilogy to the same standard, and using the selfish and narcissistic excuse that his opinion doesn't matter anymore. This idea of ownership equals authority on an intellectual property is stupid. This would invalidate practically every creator, past, present, and future, that may have never owned their creation. As an example, SpongeBob was created by Steven Hillenburg, but he never owned SpongeBob. It was owned by Nickelodeon. By your standards, Stephen Hillenburg's opinion never mattered on his own creation, which is an incredibly selfish and narcissistic mindset to have, because we wouldn't have SpongeBob without the creator of it. There are countless times Nickelodeon took a dump on Stephen Hillenburg. In one of the most hated episodes, To Love a Patty, SpongeBob fell in love with a Krabby Patty, and SpongeBob is out of character for one main reason. SpongeBob is asexual, meaning he cannot feel romantic attraction to anyone of any gender. Period. This is not my interpretation. This is what Steven Hillenburg said. So if you disagree, you can go fuck yourself. The same applies to George Lucas and any other creator concerning their creation. And it's not like people who say that cared about what George Lucas thought while he owned Star Wars, so in actuality they're just imposing their viewpoint without having fair standards they abide by. People like to try and get around this by citing false narratives like Saved in the Edit and all of the good stuff was because of Lawrence Kasdan. I'm going to debunk the Lawrence Kasdan narrative in another video, but the point I'm making is that George Lucas's word is the final say on his creation. Period. That doesn't make his ideas the best ever, I'm not saying that, but if George Lucas says something that applies to the story, you shut up and listen to him. I'm sick and tired of OT fanatics imposing their own will on Star Wars and pretending they know more about Star Wars than George Lucas. When it comes to what Star Wars is or isn't, George Lucas is law. Even if one part of the original trilogy was not what George Lucas wanted, George Lucas still has the final say on what his story means. He decides what is true Star Wars and what isn't. I've come across several people that confuse quality for what's authentic. The prequels had the same visionary mind behind it as the originals. People try to pretend that George Lucas was an arrogant hack who was guided by other people who actually knew what they were doing, and the mindset comes from complete ignorance. Again, I'll talk about the Lawrence Kasdan narrative in a separate video. But for now, your challenge is to listen to George Lucas for once. Stop being overzealous fans who think their version of Star Wars is the correct one, because it isn't. Understand Star Wars through George Lucas and stop trying to do everything in your power to discredit him, and if you do this properly, you'll realize that the prequels don't violate anyone's childhoods. You just thought it did because you're an idiot. People usually make the cop-out criticism that the prequels are boring and thus they're bad, but the thing is, boring does not automatically equal bad. The thing is, what you find boring doesn't automatically make it bad. I find Lord of the Rings incredibly boring, for example, but that doesn't make it bad or badly made movies. Of course, the same people who say the prequels are boring are the same people who have the attention span of a goldfish. But beyond that, people don't properly explain why the prequels are boring, and how them being boring makes it bad automatically. I think The Last Jedi is incredibly boring, but it isn't an automatic problem with the movie, unless I explain it, in which I will now. The Last Jedi is boring because it has an overload of filler, it isn't engaging because it tends to push you away, it isn't engaging because it has stuff like pretentious themes and messages that not everyone is going to be on board with, and so on and so forth. Maybe that'll be another video. When Cosmonaut Variety Hour said the prequels were boring, he said that it had a lack of energy, with no elaboration on what the hell that meant. What does lack of energy mean? Does it mean that the characters aren't constantly hyperactive or quippy? Having a movie be overly energetic can also hurt a movie. Like in a comedy, for example, if you're too over the top, it can ruin the jokes. Comedic pacing is key in that instance. Cosmonaut also said that he couldn't figure out the beginning, middle, and end of The Phantom Menace, and he doesn't really explain why. That's the thing with a lot of prequel haters. They don't explain why something is bad. They just point at it and expect their audience to agree with them just because they're bashing movies that were hated for the longest time. Things need to be judged case by case. What works in one movie may not work in another. It depends on the context and how the movie is structured, and so on and so forth. The issue with prequel haters is that they can't explain why they hate anything. A romance between the two characters, who are both being awkward, doesn't automatically prove why the movie is bad. Go into more depth. look at the context of the movie and the deeper connective tissue, but if you did that, you'd immediately realize that the film actually makes complete sense and you just wanted it to be a certain way. I Don't Like Sand is often bashed, and the prequel haters don't actually explain why it's bad. They just show the line out of context without explaining why it's bad in the movie's plot. So here's your challenge, prequel haters. Explain how and why, and go and watch the movies again so that you fully understand what's going on and why. And that brings me on to the last challenge. When it comes to the prequels, most of the negative critics don't pay enough attention to the movies, and they end up saying some idiotic things that are derived from not paying attention. Going back to Cosmonaut Variety Hour, in his prequel reviews, he gets stuff, big and small, dead wrong. And it isn't opinion stuff. It's stuff that he actively gets wrong in the films. For example, when he says that Anakin was rejected by the Jedi Council because they said he was too evil, when really, it was because he's too old. And right afterwards, he acts confused on why Qui-Gon Jinn is going to train Anakin anyways, without realizing that he's defying the Council. Also, he gets the entire discussion between Obi-Wan and Jango Fett wrong, when he inaccurately describes the information relayed to Obi-Wan, and thinks that Obi-Wan has enough information to connect Dooku to the clones, when in actuality, he doesn't, and Cosmonaut is an idiot who wasn't paying attention. Now seriously, you can get things wrong in a review. It's human error. But the thing is, a lot of these reviews are long, with reviewers like Cosmonaut saying that they're huge Star Wars fans who are deeply invested in the universe, which is doubtful given how much he gets wrong all the time. But Cosmonaut Variety Hour doesn't correct his mistakes, or any of the other prequel haters, at all. They just persist or make excuses to the end of the earth because they can't admit they misrepresented the movie. This applies to everything. If I'm going to review the sequels, I'm going to do my damnedest to understand what the films were doing, and why in the structure of the story, it's a fault in regards to continuity, how things are presented, what the film does or doesn't explain, etc. If you're making an hour-long critique, I'd like to think you've assessed the movie as much as possible under the circumstances, and if you haven't, then why are you making the video? You should go back, watch the movie again, write notes, assess context and whatnot. Prequel haters don't do that. Prequel haters get opinion from some idiot's faulty perspective on the internet, again and again, and they never stop to watch the movies for themselves and just decide to bash them, and they actually only watch the movies around the idea of bashing it, instead of maybe trying to enjoy them. They can't assess them without the mentality of ripping them apart. But they never ever stop to think whether it's just or if it's actually unfair. The most absurd example of people not understanding the movies is the opening of The Phantom Menace. People actively question why the Trade Federation is blockading Naboo, and you can quite clearly tell on how they complain about it, because it's not actually a problem with the movie. It's just them being too stupid and too uneducated to understand politics, and what taxation to outlying star systems being in dispute means, and it's not the fault of George Lucas. If you're so stupid you can't understand something that happens in the real world, and you whine that you wanted something more exciting, then that kind of just shows that you're a shallow fanboy who can't use their heads. You complain that Anakin was supposedly an idiot because he couldn't figure out that Palpatine was the Sith Lord and manipulating him, and the irony being that you couldn't figure out why the Trade Federation was blockading Naboo when the information is in the movie. It's just that you were too stupid to understand what taxations and trade disputes are. And that's not on George Lucas, it's on you. And if you disagree, then here's your challenge. Watch the movies again and again until you fully understand what happens in them, and tell me why the prequels still suck. Everyone else, including kids, can understand them just fine. And if you still can't figure out why the Trade Federation is blockading Naboo, you should be fucking embarrassed that you couldn't understand a simple real-world concept like taxes or trade disputes when kids far younger than you can. That alone should speak for itself, that you are just an idiot who can't understand anything besides the pew-pew, lightsabers, and space battles, which makes you look extremely shallow and makes you look like an utter dumbass. Even after I explained why Anakin had no reason to believe Palpatine was the Sith Lord, the response I got was, no matter how you spin it, he's still an idiot. Which kind of just says it all. So that's my video. This list is full of tough-ass points that I doubt prequel haters will be able to respond to without making weak points or missing the fucking point of what I was saying. If you're a prequel hater, do all 10 challenges, and if you manage to make it past all of them, which is doubtful, then explain why the prequels still suck like shit. You won't be able to because your thinking is so rigid, but I'd love to see you try. Now this is the second entry of the 10 challenges trilogy. Let's get on with the third next time. That being 10 challenges for expanded universe haters. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes? Hello. To finish the fight against the heavily misguided categories of Star Wars fans, I'm going to take a look at those who hate the expanded universe. Given I'm the type of guy who bases his opinions off of crucial understandings and research, rather than interpretations and assumptions, I'm 110% convinced that the expanded universe haters are clueless, and they mostly only really started to pop up after the EU was officially decanonized. Everyone who hates the EU, or at the very least says it was never canon, have little to no understanding of the expanded universe. When I discuss the expanded universe haters, I know what the hell I'm talking about. I've made a lot of preparation for the 10 challenges trilogy, and maybe after this, I'll make a spin-off like perhaps 5 challenges for Filoni groupies or fanboys. I haven't come up with the final title yet, but I'll put it out on a poll on what you think sounds better. But I'm planning ahead. It's almost like the 10 challenges series is becoming its own franchise. After this, it'll probably be 5 challenges onwards, but still, here are the 10 challenges for expanded universe haters. Once I complete the trilogy, you will fully understand my basic stance on Star Wars. That being that the sequels suck, prequels rule, and the expanded universe is slandered to all hell. Let's begin. For our first challenge, here's something every expanded universe hater should have done, but were too lazy to do. When EU haters boldly claim a massive chunk of the expanded universe was garbage, everyone who has ever said that has read little to no expanded universe content. Like, the more accessible EU content like the video games are a small fraction of the bigger expanded universe. Remember when I debunked Pauper memes? He tried telling me even though he says the expanded universe was never canon, that he was a fan of it, because he played all those games. And I pointed out to him that given the games are the most accessible, that you aren't exactly an EU fan until you read the books and comics and other licensed stuff. The expanded universe fanbase is a more literary fanbase than anything. That being that true expanded universe fans read the novels and comics. So here's an idea. If you want to boldly claim that the expanded universe was 90% garbage, or 70% garbage, or whatever percent garbage, here's something you should do. Actually read the percentage and experience the stories for yourself. I know it may seem daunting to read all of it, but you're the one who decided to make an absolute statement based on inexperience. And as a wise Jedi Master once said,
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
in my 10 challenges for sequel fans video, I put out a challenge and an offer to buy whoever contacts me first, and I'll buy them the Heir to the Empire audiobook to get them started, so they'll see the contrasting quality with the sequel trilogy. Even if you don't like reading, the audiobook option is there. The main EU novels have been re-released as expressive audiobooks presented like a new movie. The only difference being that you need to use your head to visualize everything, which is something EU haters never seem to do. Just like prequel haters, they never seem to do anything critically, like thinking critically. The expanded universe encompasses 30 plus years of lore. The audiobooks are quite long, but just like exercise, the more you'll do it, the more you'll get used to it. Also, on top of that, reading 90% of the expanded universe is a challenge in of itself, because even within the EU fan base, there are a few that have read absolutely every story, and that's because there's different stories published in different regions, so not one country has all the content. Like, Star Wars is an American film franchise, but there's content like perhaps comics released in the UK that are exclusive to that region. But still, it's way quicker to read the expanded universe than Disney canon. Because looking at the rate Disney pumps shit out, Disney canon already outnumbers the expanded universe. The audiobook giveaway is still valid to the first sequel fan or expanded universe hater that contacts me, and I will give it away on a whim on Amazon's Audible. But so far, none have taken me up on my challenge. And given it's been 5 to 6 months since I first gave the challenge, it seems no one will take me up on it, which puts a huge grin on my face, because I know I pulled one over them. But hey, if you're an expanded universe hater, then contact me on Discord and ask me if they can have the audiobook. And I'm only getting it for you on the guarantee that you'll listen to the whole thing, beginning to end. That's the penalty for getting something for free. If anyone is brave enough to take me up on my challenge, then I will ask them general questions about the story to prove that they read it. As soon as the audiobook is redeemed, I will tell everyone that a sequel fan or an expanded universe hater took me up on my challenge. Again, the challenge is still open as of this recording, but only to sequel fans or expanded universe haters specifically. I'm not going to give this to anyone who already agrees with me. Sorry, but I need minds to be changed. But since we've got a long road ahead of us, I'm going to get a lot, and I mean a lot, of excuses. And don't worry, I've accounted for all of them, which leads me to my next point. This is a point similar to my context point in my 10 challenges for Prequel Haters video, with a twist. While prequel haters don't watch the prequels properly, expanded universe haters don't read the EU stories at all, and just like a game of Chinese whispers, get the context of many stories wrong. Here, I'm going to explain the context behind all of the talking points of 10 dumbest things in the EU that a lot of talentless journalists make. First, let's start with the most iconic EU trashing point. Skippy the Force-sensitive droid. Looking at Skippy the droid on Wikipedia, it says at the very top that the story was never legitimate canon in any sense, and it was non-canon satire. This is partly Disney's fault for republishing the story under the Legends label without the previous Infinities label. What's Affinities? Well, basically every single non-canon story, like the what-ifs and the dark side endings of games and that sort of shit that do not line up with the films or anything else in the expanded universe. What basically happened here is that the journalist was so desperate to find non-existent dumb things in the expanded universe that they sourced a satirical stupid story made for fun and tried painting that as an actual expanded universe story, because even the Wikipedia article on Skippy fucking confirms he was never canon. That's the most that's canon about him, is the legend. But the legend never actually happened. It's just a story in universe. Next, let's talk about Dark Empire. This story is not comparable to The Rise of Skywalker upon closer analysis for several main reasons. The one that relates to this video is that people who criticize Dark Empire, first of all, have never read it. They look at it with the mentality of the prequel trilogy existing. But Dark Empire was a story written before the prequels. You know, before a lot of the established rules were into the ground. George Lucas suggested bringing the Emperor back, but that didn't make him a fucking idiot, given he was still contemplating on making the prequel trilogy. So obviously, Palpatine coming back with the original trilogy being the only George Lucas canon that existed at the time would obviously mean something very, very different. Also, another talking point about Dark Empire is how Luke falls to the dark side, but Luke was actually trying to kill the Emperor. Context. There's more going on than a short summary made by a Disney shill. So what about Mount Sorrow, the crying mountain on Endor? This is one of the dumbest anti-expanded universe arguments, because the source of the damn story was a comic written in the 80s for young children. Leland Chi, keeper of the holocron, actually explains that the Ewoks' perception of reality is completely skewed by tradition and religion. So just like the Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians, they see the world differently due to their lack of understanding. Mount Sorrow is basically just a fucking legend in Ewok culture. I studied Aboriginal Australian culture in fucking primary school, and the stories they have completely make them view the world differently to those with more perception of the world, given Native Australians were isolated from the rest of the world until Captain Cook showed up, and years later, Arthur Phillip decided to make a colony in what we call today Sydney. Since I'm having fun, let's talk about another misunderstood plot point, that being Chewbacca's death. Of course, haters who haven't even read the story phrase his canonical death in a way that makes it sound dumb. But if you actually read the story, you would understand that Chewbacca died a hero's death in the saddest way possible. He saved Anakin Solo when he was unconscious, as the planet he was on was about to be destroyed and the moon was going to collide with the planet. Chewbacca had one last heroic roar before meeting his end. When I discuss the context like that, it sounds way cooler than a moon landed on Chewbacca's head. Also, the aftermath of his death was no fucking joke, as Han Solo went into a deep depression, and it took him 5 fucking books to move past it. As you can tell, I'm just gonna keep going. An extremely bizarre, out of context remark that actually exists from idiots who didn't read the story is the claim that Luke fell in love with a computer. This is especially absurd because the story is called the Callista Trilogy, and Luke did not fall in love with the fucking computer. He fell in love with a Jedi called Callista, whose soul was trapped inside the computer. Context. But I'm still not done. Let's talk about all the super weapons built after Return of the Jedi, where again, those stories were written before the prequel trilogy came out, and before the logistics of George Lucas canon were established. But on top of that, the construction of the super weapons are explained. The Sun Crusher gets hated for being overpowered, but it possessed a revolutionary new armor called quantum armor, and it took an alien mind, the researcher Qui Zux, to conceive of the weapon. So it wasn't something they could build easily or instantly. The Death Star took 19 years to build, and the Death Star 2 was built in 4 years during wartime, whereas the first Death Star's construction was kept a secret to the galaxy. Context. So here's the challenge for Expanded Universe haters. Explain to me why the stories are still dumb after I proved you misrepresented them. A lot of the stories I pointed out were written before the prequel trilogy. If you can't explain why they're stupid after I explained all the context, and give the Expanded Universe a real chance, and if you're still persistent, let's move on. For those who try to say the Expanded Universe had no continuity, and it was a jumbled mess, well, first of all, you're dead wrong, and second, you shouldn't be looking at the continuity in the Star Wars franchise in the traditional sense. The thing is, they hierarched content and stacked them up against each other based on validity in the Star Wars canon. Continuity was assembled and judged in an organized tier list. Let's go through the original hierarchy, and don't worry, we'll talk about TCW later down the line. But here was the established tier list until 2008 that so many people sleep on when discussing the EU. At the top we have George Lucas canon. This is the tier that is irrefutably canon in every way, and how appropriate, given Star Wars is first and foremost a film series, which seems to be something Disney doesn't understand, and they rely on Dave Filoni Plus to bail them out of a jam. I'm also going to discuss George Lucas' stance on the expanded universe later down the line, so let's continue. Next we've got C canon, or continuity canon, which basically comprise of nearly all mainstream Star Wars content under the George Lucas regime. That includes the comics, games, novels, and stuff released in the mainstream continuity. Next we've got secondary canon, or S canon, which basically includes Star Wars stories that were introduced very early in the franchise's history, such as the original Star Wars Marvel comics, that admittedly had a lot of, shall we say, out there stories. And given the original trilogy wasn't even done yet, It made for a lot of cool stories, but it's considered S-canon because said stories, again, were very out there. Lastly, we have non-canon. Stories that never happened in any capacity, like Lego Star Wars, and satirical stories like Skippy the Droid, which a lot of the moronic journalists desperate to find dumb things in the EU failed to pick up on. That is pathetic, honestly. The comic itself made it clear it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. Maybe they should have read the story, and that was on the full tier list of the Star Wars franchise. Sure, it took years for the continuity hierarchy to be established, but it was established when they absolutely needed to. Given Star Wars got so many fucking books, they needed to categorize them all at some point. These 4 tiers made the expanded universe organized and easy to keep track of. People don't realize that not everything would be followed from, say, S-canon. The stance on that tier has them selectively referencing stuff in higher canon material, mostly C-canon, so in a way it's semi-canon. Some things might be canon and others not. If the expanded universe wasn't organized like this, then I would say yeah, it's messy and jumbled. But given the canon hierarchy exists, it wasn't. The holocron was established in 2000. What's the holocron? Well, basically it's the division of Lucas Licensing that kept track of continuity, and given it was a year after The Phantom Menace, it was extremely appropriate timing. Leland Chi, keeper of the holocron, kept continuity in order, telling stories who wrote stories onwards what they could and couldn't do. And given the prequel trilogy was being made, that was extremely important in regards to EU content from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But why wasn't the holocron established earlier? Well, here's the thing. Given George Lucas in the 90s was still trying to decide whether or not to make the prequel trilogy, there wasn't much of a demand to keep all the continuity in check for a trilogy that George didn't know he was going to make. But even before then, the expanded universe did a pretty good job of maintaining its own continuity. One extremely hard-hitting example is the original Marvel comics, ironically. There were a lot of ideas for the comics that Lucasfilm shut down. Lucasfilm refused to let Lando adopt pacifist views, that sometimes violence was necessary, fight for the right thing. In post-Empire Strikes Back comic books, Lucasfilm refused to let them touch Why Don't They Rescue Han stories, because they were making Return of the Jedi. Marvel Star Wars issues 51 and 52 were going to have the Death Star Mark II be the main threat, but Lucasfilm shot them down and told them to write different super weapons. Yeah, as early as the 70s and 80s, they were keeping continuity in check. Continuity is something they really cared about, wasn't it? But good luck finding this level of nuance from the dumbass, misguided journalists spouting the same misconceptions over and over. My buddy Iron Inquisitor has disputed an article by One Force Wave, where he basically talks trash about the expanded universe and whatnot. So what your challenge is now, is to always remember the canon hierarchy, no matter what. And if you're going to keep your stance intact, then keep this in mind. The Force Wave article previously mentioned was mostly about how George Lucas saw the expanded universe, which leads me to... I see a lot of people who try to use George Lucas to say the expanded universe was never canon. First of all, have no such standards with the sequel trilogy, and I've already disputed the George Lucas sold the rights to Disney argument, which, to sum it up, if Disney did not want to abide by George Lucas canon, then they should have decanonized George Lucas canon. And that includes the 6 mainline Star Wars movies, but they didn't, because they needed that stuff to sell tickets for the sequel trilogy. The reason I say that is because what George Lucas has said about his work, and the meaning of it, are also irrefutably valid. And on top of Disney invalidating his work externally, they've also done it internally. I've discussed in my video explaining how the Force works that the interpretation argument is utter rubbish. So yeah, hold the sequel trilogy to the same standard and stop making excuses. Anyhow, this video is about George Lucas and the expanded universe. EU haters are very, very selective on what they talk about. And what I mean by that is that George Lucas has a lot of statements on the expanded universe, but they cherry pick the ones that make the expanded universe out to be never canon. But if you actually looked at every quote ever, the answer is not very black and white. George Lucas doesn't have an automatic yes or no answer. It's middle of the ground and very nuanced. I've seen the Star-Lord quote a million times, so stop shoving it in my face. It's an extremely cherry-picked quote and not representative of the full picture. What I mean is that if you look at George Lucas's remarks about the expanded universe, you don't get a simple answer, but further research is required to understand. Splinter of the Mind's Eye, in the very book's introduction, George wrote this in the 1997 re-release of the book. In my opinion, this should be the main quote instead of the crappy Star-Lord quote, because the way George Lucas wrote the intro to the re-release is talking about the legacy of the book, and I think it's way more insightful into how he sees the expanded universe than just Star-Lord. Like, obviously nobody's denying that the Star-Lord quote exists, but he said a lot of other things that don't line up with the baseline, Star-Lord proves that the EU was never canon narrative. If you look at all of the quotes for the full picture, the answer is not as simple as a yes or no, but there are nuances to everything, aren't there? If you go and watch Inquisitor's video, which includes a lot of conflicting statements, I think it's clear that George Lucas doesn't automatically say no. One thing so many people fucking sleep on is that everything in the expanded universe, or at least the main plot points, had to go through George, and George himself was an active collaborator in the expanded universe. If you watch the behind the scenes featurettes on The Force Unleashed, for example, you'll immediately see that George and the game makers played off of each other during its development, expressing ideas to one another, and George Lucas gave a lot of input on how characters should be written and whatnot, such as the Emperor and Vader's relationship. You see, George Lucas doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. Around the time TCW started airing, George Lucas stated how his story is limited to Anakin and Luke Skywalker, and everything that surrounds them, and that, what do you know, the expanded universe already told the story of what happened after, but in his canon, nothing much happened. But that doesn't make the post-Return of the Jedi stories non-canon, if that makes sense. Like, George says that if you want post-Return of the Jedi stories, then go read the Thrawn trilogy or something. And just to clear something up, when it comes to George Lucas's sequel trilogy treatments, he was mostly going through with it if someone else was making the sequel trilogy directly. Case in point, Disney. But as I explained, Disney threw most of his ideas out the window, and the ones they kept were extremely cherry-picked and devoid from the original context. I'm still annoyed that people think Luke being on an island, isolated, would have been the exact same as The Last Jedi, because a lot more happened in that film than just Luke being on an island. And given the sentiment we have from George is that he hated the film, I think it's safe to say George would have done it differently. I mean, he talks about how Disney didn't listen to him in the Charlie Rose interview, but I'm getting off track. The challenge for EU haters is to take every single quote from George, and with the complete picture, explain how the expanded universe is definitely not canon in your opinion. When it comes to my previous points, I've pointed out how everyone cherry picks to death, and when confronted with additional information and context, they ignore it because they need to defend at any cost, and that includes their integrity. I've spoken about cherry-picked and out-of-context EU stories and plot points, and also quotes that people use selectively from George Lucas and ignore everything else, like how he views, say, the sequel trilogy. This is incredibly annoying. Well, here's an idea. Why don't you write an essay about the wider expanded universe rather than just picking out some stories out of context? Mount Sorrow, as mentioned before, is cherry-picked, because no journalist I've seen ever discusses what's in the other Ewok comic issues. Wouldn't that be extremely interesting to hear what's in the same series as Mount Sorrow? Because to me, I think Mount Sorrow, on top of being out of context, is extremely one-off and doesn't appear in the rest of the damn expanded universe, and virtually has zero impact on it. One thing that me and my co-writers, yes I have co-writers, notice about EU haters is that a lot of them absolutely despise the Yu Zhong Vong for being cut off from the Force, and then they never talk about the Yslamari from the Thrawn trilogy, or hell, the Rakardan tribes and Knights of the Old Republic. It wouldn't surprise if they never actually caught on to the idea that Force sensitivity could be lost. I'm aware that the Yuzong Vong are extremely immune given they cannot be sensed, but the Yslamari did the same damn thing in Heir to the Empire. I remember from how Luke's perspective, his temporary loss of the Force was like having all his senses cut off at once. What about the Jedi Exile then? Knights of the Old Republic 2 explains that the Jedi Exile was a walking wound to the Force. And how many of you haters would have any idea what a wound in the Force is? Probably none of you, otherwise you wouldn't be complaining. But beyond that, there's countless other examples of stuff you hate on that is all over the EU, but you only mention it in a specific story. But on top of that, a lot of the haters don't explain why they hate a specific part and nothing else. Sorry to cut this point short, but basically the challenge I'm giving you is to stop cherry picking. Look at the wider expanded universe and see whether or not your hate is justified, which it isn't. Now let's move on. Something that really brings my piss to a boil is how EU haters bring up a specific story that supposedly contradicts the films, mostly the prequels, and say how the EU has no continuity. But the thing is, you should be looking at the wider expanded universe. As an example, when an Imperial character, Gillen Paleon, references fighting clones in the Clone Wars, even though he would have canonically been on the Republic side, there was a story that shows him fighting a batch of separatist clones. Not only is the plot hole non-existent with additional context, but also separatist clones make for an interesting story during the Clone Wars, don't you think? You'd wish Dave Filoni would have done that at some point, instead of fucking filler episodes. In fact, a lot of the confusion anyone could have about the Thrawn stories from the 90s are patched in later books. For example, the Outbound Flight novel, which ties Jorah Sabayoth and Thrawn into the prequel trilogy, and it's actually quite remarkable how they connect the dots. Expanded universe authors in the later years really came up with creative explanations for the stuff that didn't immediately make sense. Another example is Boba Fett. Previous material suggested that he was a former stormtrooper, and that Boba Fett wasn't even his real name. It might have been Jaster Mareel instead. But when Attack of the Clones explored Boba Fett's backstory, what did the EU writers do? Did they panic and overwrite the continuity without addressing the plot hole? No. Instead, they explained the retcon in a clever way. You see, Boba Fett is a clone of Jango Fett, and there would be a misconception that he was a stormtrooper given many clones became stormtroopers in the early Empire. Thus the misconception. And in regards to the name Jaster Mareel, it's revealed in the Jango Fett comics that Jaster Mareel was Jango's adopted father, which in Mandalorian terms would make Jaster Mareel Boba's grandfather. So they both explained the plot hole and made an interesting character in Jaster Mareel in the process. That's how you do things. And it's more that you can say about Disney, but we'll talk about that later. It's important to note that the EU actually strengthened continuity a hell of a lot actually. Thrawn talks about ATPTs and the devastation of Honecker during the Clone Wars, and what do we get during the Clone Wars multimedia project? ATPTs and the devastation of Honecker during the Clone Wars. Why do haters never mention that? Is it because they never bothered to read all the stories? Yes, that is exactly why. The expanded universe did not just ignore all the issues and confusion that would arise and hope no one would notice. If you believe that, you need to read more stories. Otherwise, you are the one ignoring stuff and hoping no one will call you out. Stories were intertwined in all eras of the franchise. It's more accurate to say that the stories enhanced and backed each other up, no matter when they were published. The expanded universe was not a messy clusterfuck. Supposed contradictions come from those who aren't looking at the full picture. Now, your challenge now is to bring up some real examples of the expanded universe contradicting itself or the films. It isn't impossible, but it's going to be pretty damn hard. Good luck. To anyone trying to say that the expanded universe was dumb and still using extremely out of context sources, just look at what Disney did to their own expanded universe. Everything people trash the EU for, without research, is infinitely more applicable to Disney canon. Mount Sorrow in Disney canon might as well be the living mountains Yoda fought in a throwaway comic. It's almost embarrassing how much they actually copied and pasted the ideas from the expanded universe to steal for their own continuity. The Rise of Skywalker is a classic example. They stole from Dark Empire without credit, and the look on EU haters' faces when they had to suck up to reality. They actually recycle a lot of the characters from the old expanded universe. Thrawn is perhaps the biggest example, but there are other examples including, but not limited to, Jackson, Rook, Shizor, Paleon, Revan, Tenebris, Pestige, Zim, Tev, etc. They took a lot of characters from the expanded universe and repurposed them for their own agenda, and I wouldn't be surprised if most EU haters have never ever heard of most of the characters I mentioned. Remember Dirge? If you've never heard of him, then you're not a true Star Wars fan. But jokes aside, Disney copied and pasted his character for the Dr. Aphra comics. Yeah, Dr. Aphra, that annoying character that has a World War II pilot hat for some reason. Dirge appears in the comics. Now, I don't necessarily care about the context of his appearance, because the point is that he's just fucking ripped out of Legends and repurposed in Disney canon. Seriously, I remember when EU haters said that Disney would never quote-unquote have any of the dumb stuff from the expanded universe, only for Disney to do that many times. Let's go over some more examples. Kylo Ren, the most complex Star Wars character, according to Goldman at least, is a quintuple ripoff. He's got a similar story arc to Jason Solo as Darth Caedus. Since TFA leaves off where the EU ended, he could easily qualify as Ben Skywalker, especially with a name. He's cosplaying as Revan. He's this new generation's Darth Vader, and he's named after the villain, Kylo Ren, from the 1980s droid cartoon. You didn't think I'd notice, did you, JJ? If you're really digging, he might even be a sextuple or septuple or octuple ripoff if you look even deeper, and it becomes a massive rabbit hole of JJ's unoriginality, as he just copied and pasted stuff from the EU to shape Kylo Ren. I wish more people would bring this up when talking about the sequels, that it's not just the original trilogy. Most of what the sequel fans praise as different are actually mostly recycled from the expanded universe. But given they took extremely out of context stuff from those stories, they end up being a mess, as most rip-offs do when you copy something and don't bother to have it make sense in your story's context. On top of them stealing Dark Empire, they also ripped off Rey's retcon backstory from Ken Palpatine. Who's Ken Palpatine? Great question. He's the grandson of the big bad Palpatine in Legends. Sort of. Yeah, so not only is Rey Palpatine reveal absolute dog shit, but it was stolen from a far superior character most people probably haven't heard of. They made the unoriginal Mary Sue character and somehow made her even more of a rip-off by retconning her backstory and at the same time copying another character's story. I'd be surprised if any sequel fan ever brings this up. That might be a challenge in of itself for sequel fans. But anyhow, you get the damn point. Disney on countless occasions, across different authors, just take what they want from Legends and either recanonize it, with the shills praising them for making something canon again, or they just name it under something else. And the same shills will express ignorance and think Disney came up with it to begin with. Believe me, after so much time refuting everything Disney shills say, they don't just stop defending a corporate entity. So the challenge for Expanded Universe haters specifically is to look at absolutely everything that was in Disney canon and see how much of it was derivative off of Legends, and then tell me how much Star Wars is crap if over half of the stuff they like is in Disney canon is just a damn ripoff. Do that and we'll talk about other things. But hey, I believe in you to fail at this challenge. You're probably wondering why I called this Mickey Mouse's Whorehouse. Well, on top of the fact that it's funny as fuck, it's extremely accurate to what I'm about to say. Something that was in an actual Star Wars book, by Disney is Queen's Peril, which deals with a menstruating Padme setting off blood sensors in the royal palace of Theed. Ooh, what about the fart wedding that was in an actual Star Wars Disney story? Yeah, I'm not making either of those two up. And I don't give two shits whether or not the fart wedding was in a kid-oriented story or not. You compare it to Mount Sorrow, and it's so much more mature in comparison. The stuff that tries to be serious in Disney canon just fucking fall flat. We know by now that the infamous Aftermath trilogy, made by one Chuck Wendick, one of the dumbest lines he wrote was this. So fucking immature, isn't it? That's dumb as hell. And I'm not done yet. Oh no, I'm not going to stop there. As Shia LaBeouf would say, let's keep going. In the Darth Vader comics, which from what I've read is incredibly stupid from the first 6 issues alone, has this character that is literally Admiral Akbar attached to General Grievous's body. Yeah, that's right. The comic writer was so uninspired that he actually thought that made for something anyone could take seriously. Let's point out some more dumb stuff, like Operation Cinder. Given they were too lazy to come up with a nuanced explanation for how the Galactic Civil War ended, they basically had the Empire stoop to the IQ level of a toddler and fucking give the rebels the victory on the silver plate. I've ripped into my Battlefront 2 EA campaign critique, so go watch that for more information. But Operation Cinder regardless is dumb as hell. I was immediately taken out of The Mandalorian when they referenced that. Like, Dave Filoni actually thought that was a good thing to reference. Ooh, let's cherry pick some more dumb stuff. How about the fact that the Inquisitors fly their lightsabers like a helicopter? Which makes no sense. I thought lightsaber blades were weightless, but if the Darksaber taught me anything, it's that Disney doesn't understand lightsabers. At all. If you're begging me to stop trashing your precious Disney Expanded Universe, too bad, because I'm going to keep going. Let's talk about how much Disney canon contradicts itself. The sequels obviously contradict everything in the original 6 movies, so that's a start, but beyond that, the Ahsoka novel was completely discarded when the Clone Wars Season 7 came out. Dave Filoni just couldn't keep continuity intact, could he? And have Captain Rex have his inhibitor chip already fucking removed. What about Kanan the Last Padawan? A story that wasn't half bad, discarded when Filoni wanted the Sand Batch to be in the limelight when it comes to Caleb Doom surviving Order 66. They made his survival pathetically weak in the Sand Batch, so it was a notable loss in quality. What about when Yoda's lightsaber was destroyed and Luke just pulls it out in the Book of Boba Fett Episode 6, The Mandalorian Season 2.5 Episode 2, and Ahsoka Season 0 Episode 2? How did Luke get a lightsaber that was already destroyed? That makes no sense. As you can probably expect, Disney has not only added dumb shit in their canon, but their canon contradicts itself. Unlike the original hierarchy, Disney had no such thing. It's why I fully expect the High Republic novels to be discarded in a few years. I feel minorly sorry for anyone dumb enough to think the High Republic novels mean shit. Also, it's led to video games becoming stale because the gameplay and mechanics are taken so fucking literally. The reason they didn't have a pink Darth Vader, for example, was because it would break canon, as if there was a canonical fight to the death between Rey and Darth Maul, and Darth Maul, after losing, just respawned and slashed at Rey again, while Darth Vader joined in to help Maul. Also, if that's the case, then did soldiers on the battlefront canonically pay thousands of dollars in microtransactions to get skins and star cards? I don't imagine Imperial Stormtroopers being that paid a higher wage. So it's almost like Stormtroopers spent their own pocket money on star cards that magically boost their abilities. Did they also pre-order the ability to fight on the battlefront early or something? Disney has basically taken their canon far too literally and not literally enough at the same time. Talk about convoluted. It explains why Fallen Order was very cookie cutter, but it's so goddamn dumb regardless. So here's your challenge. Try to justify everything I put forth, because this encompasses like at least 70% of Disney canon. If anything, it's Disney canon that is 70 to 90% garbage. Let's move on. Here's something I wish Expanded Universe haters would address. Pretty much no one said the Expanded Universe wasn't canon while it was canon. In the same way people say George Lucas sold the rights so his opinion doesn't matter anymore, never cared about what he thought while he owned Star Wars, it's all a retrospective narrative, made to fulfill an agenda, that being that Disney is so much better than the pathetic expanded universe. This is the reason this video is being made, because someone has to set the record straight. All the classic EU hater arguments discussed so far, like 90% of the content was garbage, the EU had no continuity and it was a mess, Skippy the Droid was a canon story, etc., only came after the Disney purchase. Those who never bothered to experience the expanded universe and became attached to Disney's corporate anti-art only started to perpetuate this narrative to defend it. Although it did become a thing once Dave Filoni happened. Although it wasn't severe until Disney because they were still continuing the expanded universe. I've seen Disney higher-ups, after decanonizing the expanded universe, try to make people believe the expanded universe was a convoluted mess. In a very ironic quote from Dave Filoni in the foreword to the Disney canon novel A New Dawn, he said, and I quote,
"The old concept of what is canon and what isn't is gone. And from this point forward, our stories and characters all exist in the same universe. The key creatives who work on the films, television, comic books, video games, and novels are all connected creatively for the first time in the history of the Star Wars universe."
Of course it would be Dave Filoni that said that, because he had little to no experience with the expanded universe. TCW and expanded universe we'll talk about later, but the point I'm making is that absolutely no one, unless they weren't fans to begin with, argued that the expanded universe was never canon. They've only started to say so after 2008, where all of their talking points kinda make sense somewhat. I mean, they still failed to consider nuances, but at least they could perpetuate a false narrative out of context. It seems like the guy who built up this idea was Dave Filoni himself, and how appropriate it would be him. He was given an unnatural amount of power over continuity, and he did what he pleased. He pretended that his shit was part of the expanded universe when it really wasn't. There's this archived article from early 2008 that asked 5 questions relating to the upcoming show at the time, and I saw a blatant bit of false advertising, where it says that the Clone Wars 2008 would not overwrite or contradict the 2003 microseries. Yeah, right. Go to hell. Anyone saying that the expanded universe was never canon prior to 2008 would probably be exceptionally hard to find. And that's because practically no one said it was non-canon while it was canon, because they'd obviously be wrong. It becomes easier and more practical to do so after 2008 and after the Disney buyout, because it suited a narrative that didn't exist prior to that point. So here's your challenge. Explain why absolutely no one regarded it as non-canon while it was still canon. Maybe try to find non-cherry-picked quotes that actually definitively establish it was never canon. Good luck! There's a big misconception I wanted to say for last. That being that the Clone Wars 2008 was the only true extension of George Lucas's work. It wasn't. People use this excuse to explain why TCW wasn't decanonized along with the rest of the expanded universe. And the truth is, George Lucas was just as involved in many other things, such as the Ewok movies and the holiday special. But they weren't made canon, were they? The Clone Wars was always Dave Filoni's thing. Also, there's the fact that Dave Filoni snuck behind George's back to keep Ahsoka alive. Yeah, that's right. He lied to George to keep Ahsoka alive. What a loyal apprentice, am I right? I'm just joking. Filoni is no apprentice to George. That's just some narrative Filoni popped up himself, so everyone would look up to him as an encyclopedia concerning Star Wars. It's extremely sleazy, because nowadays people don't ask George any of the necessary questions. Instead, they go up to Dave Filoni and ask him questions instead. And what do you know? Dave Filoni is one of the perpetrators of the myth that the expanded universe was never canon. The same guy who cherry-picks shit and gets all the praise in the world for it. People were so happy when Thrawn was made canon again, as if Dave Filoni deserves to be regarded as a hero for bringing this extremely popular, cherry-picked character from the expanded universe and very little else. Guys, that was only done to get people to watch Rebels. Since he appears later in the show, it encourages everyone to start from the beginning, just so they can catch up to the Thrawn stuff. Very deceptive, very slimy. Seriously, it seems that everyone except for me and a handful and others don't seem to realize that Dave Filoni is an overrated cowboy who takes what he wants and receives all the praise in the world for it, regardless of whether or not he created it. The Clone Wars was always Filoni's thing. It was also never held up in G-Canon. Instead, a new slot created for it below G-Canon, known as Television Canon. Proof enough that it was never G-Canon, Star Wars Underworld, if it had been made, would have been T-Canon as well. It's more accurate to say with all that information that the expanded universe was overwritten not because it was never canon, but because Dave Filoni was given an unnatural amount of power to override it and obliterate continuity. Since a lot of casual fans ask me how Dave Filoni retcons the expanded universe, I could use many examples, such as Ahsoka being a problem because Anakin first and foremost was promoted to Jedi Knight 2 years and 6 months after the Clone Wars instead of immediately after the Battle of Geonosis. On top of that, Ahsoka was a character that was never even alluded to. Anakin did not have an apprentice. That's just something Filoni made up on the spot. There's also the fact that practically none of the battles in the original timeline made it through unscathed. Dave Filoni's show basically just made shit up. And given Anakin wasn't even supposed to be a Jedi Knight yet, all of the battles in TCW with him as a Jedi Knight, which is practically all of them, are a retcon in of itself. It's a continuity nightmare. If you want me to discuss more retcons, I have a playlist of the Clone Wars 2008. I'm still working on the Season 3 review though. What I'm here to talk about is how Dave Filoni is not a lore master, and never was. If he went up against a real lore master, that lore master, if he took his job seriously, would have ripped up Filoni's pitch for the show in a heartbeat and tell him to change everything as Filoni bursts into tears because he forgot to make copies. Given Wikipedia exists, he could have just looked shit up, or even then, ask Leland Chi or some other chap whether or not his pitch was lore accurate. Filoni is the guy who acts like he's been granted the rank of master and hides behind George as a meat shield but has little to no integrity himself. Let me repeat the point. TCW was never G-Canon and was always Filoni's thing. The expanded universe was canon but was overridden because Dave Filoni was given too much power over it. There's the context. Continuity before then was absolutely sound. So there's literally no excuse. I've explained how TCW's position in the original continuity, so the challenge for expanded universe haters, and by extension, Filoni groupies, is to explain how the expanded universe was never canon, despite all the context I just gave you. Sourcing Filoni isn't going to do much, given he's the same guy who just takes what he wants when he feels like it, and relies on Disney to bail him out, and it happens every single time, to the point where I think he's getting more and more arrogant. So that's 10 challenges for expanded universe haters, and the end of the 10 challenges trilogy. I hope you guys enjoyed this trilogy calling out the 3 main misguided categories of Star Wars fans. That being those who support the corporatized sequel trilogy, those who hate on the prequel trilogy by making stupid criticisms, and those who have never picked up a single expanded universe book in their life, but still express utmost confidence in bashing them regardless. You will find these challenges impossible to beat, because I know what I'm talking about. I remember this one guy in 10 challenges for sequel fans bluffed about beating my challenges, and then when I asked him to explain how, he no joke just told me, "Oh, I beat these challenges, I'm just not writing the answers." Seriously. My strategy to winning an argument is by talking someone to death, and this guy puts a smile on my face, as I can tell this guy is bluffing out of his ass. So if you fit all 3 categories, consider this 30 challenges for you instead of 10. With that being said, that pretty much wraps up this video. Here are my patrons on screen. And please consider subscribing so I can reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain, were you praying at the